Welcome to the Aquest Podcast, conversations about regs, funds, and governance with your host, Daniel Lawlor.
Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to this episode of the Aquest Podcast. My name is Danny Lawlor. I'm the MD of Aquest and your host for this episode. My usual co-host, Shannon Eastman, unfortunately isn't available for this one, and she's going to be raging because it's a good one. We've had a tremendous conversation for this podcast, which you're going to catch in just a moment. But if you're following the Protect Accent campaign, do check it out because you're going to see some reskinning and rebranding for them and some new marketing content, all with the fingerprints of Shannon all over it at Teacher Brand to Pitch. So take a moment to check that out. Now, a little bit of background to this episode of the Aquest Podcast. In the Irish financial services industry, we have a number of stakeholders. So, for example, from the industry perspective, we have the service providers, we have the advisory firms, we have also, of course, the regulator, we have the politicians, we have the Department of Finance. But probably the key stakeholder in all of this, the one that we're all out to try and serve and protect, are the end investors. And whilst the industry, as well as served with an industry association and directors, and the regulator is a very strong voice, it's very hard and very infrequently that you hear from the investor, because the investors don't have an association, they're not gathered and collected in that kind of way. So I've always been keen to see if we couldn't get our hands on somebody who could talk to us about the investor's perspective of the world, because as I said, ultimately that's the one that we're out to serve and to try and protect. But we very rarely, and probably most of us will never in our career, sit down face to face with one of these end investors. So for this episode and for a mini-series we're going to do, delighted to be joined by Bob Quinn, who is an independent financial advisor and runs an financial advisory practice out of County Kildare. Bob has tons of experience having those conversations with our end investors, understanding what it is that their objectives are and helping them to go on a savings and an investment path that's going to get them where they want to be. So for this episode, as I said, we're going to have a few episodes with Bob because there's absolutely tons of content to get through with them, really understanding the investor's perspective of the world. And that'll, I think, help us as investment funds industry do what we do. But for this episode, what I really wanted to understand was how Bob does what he does. So how does he engage with his clients? What is his client base? When he goes about doing suitability assessments, how does that work? What kind of questions does he ask? What is it that he's looking to know? And then when it comes to putting together a portfolio, what are the key elements in that portfolio? What's in, what's out? We even have time to talk about whether investing in an Australian gold mine is a good idea. I'm afraid Bob doesn't think it is. Spoiler alert. So with that, let's get on with the podcast. A million thanks to Bob for joining us. As I said, we've had a great conversation for this one, and there are more to come. If you're new to the Aquest Podcast, do hit the subscribe button on whatever podcast providing platform you use so that you'll be notified whenever a new podcast drop. And as we get into the autumn season, there's going to be quite a few. So keep up to date with all our content, subscribe to the podcast, and let's get on with the show. So hello, Bob Quinn, and welcome to the Aquest Podcast. This is your first appearance of what I think will be several. It's great to have you.
Danny, thanks for having me along. I appreciate it.
I have a lot of questions for you, so many that I think we're not going to cover it in just one episode. Hence, I think we'll have you back several times.
Yeah, very good.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, Bob. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Who am I? I'm a financial planner. I run a company called Roboadvisors, and I'm based down in Naas in the lovely County Kildare. And I set up the business, it will be 10 years on December 21st. And I've been running it as a financial advisory firm to individuals, typically women who are aged 50-ish. And that's who I reach out to and advise on an ongoing basis. From a personal perspective, I've got 2 kids. My young fella started primary school only last Friday, and he has a little sister as well. So we've our hands full in that regard too.
You are a busy man.
Busy, yeah, busy. My wife works full-time as well, so we tend to, like an awful lot of people out there, we are juggling a lot of demands in a COVID world between childcare and school drop-offs and all that type of stuff.
But somewhere in amongst all of that, you find the time to meet with and guide investors on their journey through taking the money from out of the mattress and finding somewhere good to put it that's going to give them a good return and hit their savings objectives.
Yeah, well, so the word you just used there is absolutely of critical importance of what we do, objectives. The first thing we need to do with a new client is establish just exactly what their goals and objectives are, because financial plans cannot be executed unless we know what we're trying to actually achieve, unless we know what we're trying to plan for. So goals and objectives are of critical importance in establishing those clearly from the start.
And I want to touch on that now in a moment. But because what I'm really interested in this episode, at least, Bob, is to understand how you do what you do, and interact with the clients. Because although we have a large investment funds industry and financial services industry here in Ireland, very, very few of us actually come face to face with the investors that we're there to serve. We're all serving members of the funds and what have you, but very few of us do what you do. So that's why I'm really interested to see and talk to you about what happens in your world in practice, because as we try to do our best for investors, hard to do that if you have never actually met an investor and you're trying to guess what it is that occupies their mind. But
yeah, of course.
I just want to know your business model. You're not a tied agent, you're independent. Is that right?
Yeah, we're a fee-only financial planning firm. When it comes along to investment advice, whether it's investments that you're making as part of a pension structure, planning for your retirement, or if it's money that you, as you said, have sitting under the mattress and you want to do something with it, we charge our clients fees. We do not take commissions on from investment funds or insurance companies, just because the sense here is if you're not paying for us, then you are the commodity. So to keep everybody honest, if you like, and motivated, is that the best way 10 years into it, or close to 10 years into it, that I've structured the business is by providing a level of transparency where there's no second guessing on who's getting paid and what. So that is of critical importance in the structure of the Money Advisors.
And is it important to your clients? Do they seek you out because they know you're independent, or is it something that is kind of not at the top of their list of requirements for an advisor?
There's two answers to that question. Answer number one is an awful lot of the business that's an awful lot of the clients that I advise is actually from existing client referrals, because very few people sit down and Google independent fee-only financial planning firm in Nace, for instance. So we are the type of business that you don't know you want us until you actually are dealing with us. So the client referral is where the vast majority of my business comes from already. But then we've seen over the last few years in particular, there are much more there are stronger demands being made by individual investors seeking out someone who isn't tied to a bank or an insurance company, seeking out someone who is entirely independent. And, I'm really kind of hopeful for the future of the business, just because of the way things have ramped up, and that in that regard of looking for independent advisors, as the case is.
But certainly in a model where I know who's getting paid what, it makes it a lot easier to understand where the conflicts of interest are. And I remember as a regulator hearing about zero fee ETFs, and at first thought you think, oh gosh, that sounds like a great deal for investors. It's zero fee. But then just about it for a moment, you think, well, if it's zero fee, then how are they making money? And then of course, not doing it for the goodness of their health. So then you got to really unpack the product and understand who's doing what, where, and how are they making fees, and how is the investor paying for this if they're not actually paying for it. So likewise with the model of yours, if you know upfront where the fee is going, then it makes it much easier to understand.
But even Danny, on that, you mentioned disclosures of conflicts and that type of stuff as well. And that's something that really needs to be explored, probably in a podcast by itself, because conflicts of interest are interesting. Every single year we do our CPD and there's an ethics webinar or whatever it might be. But the bottom line is, if you are getting paid by a third party, you can't adequately represent the investor. That's very much as far as I'm concerned. So if you claim to be your client's advocate, if you like, and you're advocating for what they want and what they need, then you have to be getting paid solely from them. And that's kind of a red line issue for me. But unfortunately, the way the industry is structured in Ireland at this point in time, the client's best interests aren't necessarily represented. And these conflicts of interest aren't adequately disclosed because, well, if everybody is doing it, then there's no conflict, that kind of way.
Yeah, well, it's an industry, and this comes up all the time. I had it this week on, we were looking at an AIFMD review letter issued by the European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA. Different text, but the same thing. It was about conflicts of interest. And I keep reminding people, the financial services industry is an agency business. It is inherently full of conflicts of interest because everybody, nearly everybody, is, you're managing money on behalf of somebody else and you have an opportunity often to profit at their expense. So there's always conflicts of interest.
Absolutely.
It's very hard, probably impossible to eliminate them. So you have to identify, monitor, manage, eliminate if you can, but otherwise mitigate. So being aware of them and still acting in your client's best interest is the important thing. But tell me a little bit about who your client base is. You mentioned 50 plus ladies in the Greater Kildare area. That's a very specific client base.
It is, yeah, but I've come to this niche, if you like, over the last few years, just because my own interests are kind of aligned with life events that are associated with, within the first instance, women of that particular age. I have good working relationships. I'm not entirely sure how I describe it, but I work very well with this particular type of client. I understand their needs and interests and requirements. So it's a bit of a no-brainer for me because they're at a tipping point in life whereby they're looking to get themselves set up for retirement. They want to ensure that their families have a level of security should anything happen to them. And there's lots of potential life events, whether it could be elderly parents requiring care or passing away. You've got potentially kids of a certain age as well that might be going off to college or whatever it is. So this particular client has a huge amount of demands being placed on them just given where they are in life. And it's the most complicated point in life. And this is where me as a financial planner can really, really make a difference in somebody's life by a few subtle changes or considerable changes can actually redefine and realign where that person's life is going. So
that's a great point. That's a great point, Bob, because again, as an industry, as a financial services industry, it's all of our jobs to do our best for the end investors. But and that could be, the way that you give legal advice. It could be the amount of fees that you charge on a fund. It could be the decisions that you make where you go for A instead of B, or how you do the valuations. It could be very net technical points, but how you do it can have an impact ultimately on the end results that the investor gets. But where a lot of people are very far removed from seeing the whites of the eyes of the persons whose money it is and for whom it makes a difference whether you get that extra few percent of return or not, because that might be the difference between affording the college fees or, the nature of the pension that you're able to draw down when that time comes. But you're right at the forefront of that. So you can see what the actual impact is of good decisions versus lesser decisions.
And that's absolutely it, because look, if it's a thing, a lot of the clients that I deal with, they haven't actually formally engaged a financial planner before. Yeah, they've been in and out of banks and brokerages and insurance companies over the years, and they've bought a bit here and bought a bit there. It's all been kind of unconnected and uncoordinated. So it comes a point where you can either continue with an uncoordinated approach to managing your finances, or you can actually then engage someone who you can use as a sounding board, if you like, who can connect the dots and who can coach and mentor you in building your finances in such a way that, as I mentioned earlier on, your goals and objectives, you have a more reasonable chance of hitting those targets at some point in the future than taking this haphazard approach to managing your finances. So it may even be a case that you don't need to get an additional return. You just need to reposition your finances in such a way that they're being organized in such a way that they're supporting your goals and objectives.
So objectives is something you mentioned there a few times. I'm pretty interested in how that piece works. So very recently, the regulator, the central bank, issued a letter to industry about, really directed at MiFID firms, about suitability assessment. So one of the features of the industry of how we help clients is to this piece where when you are introduced to a client, you sit down, you understand what their objectives are, what their position is in life, what their risk appetite is, and what is the suitable product to our investment strategy to direct them to. And that's a very key piece in terms of protecting them and making sure they're in products that match their place at their stage of life and their objectives. Now, in that letter, of course, the regulator had identified plenty of issues and failings that they found when they spoke to firms about how they did these suitability assessments. Seemed to be a big reliance on kind of check the box approach without really understanding the importance of the suitability assessment, and therefore not giving it the attention and care and love that it deserves. So talk to me about suitability assessments. In practice, you're sat down in front of somebody. How does that happen? What questions do you ask? What are you looking for?
Well, starting from the beginning, just want to change, I suppose, even the terms we use here, because suitability is, as far as I'm concerned, an incredibly broad term. And we saw Tom Perez, who was the US Secretary of Labor under Obama's tenure, brought in this kind of clause called acting in the client's best interest. And if we talk about best interests as opposed to suitability, it's a game changer again. So when I meet an investor for the first time and we're trying to tease out and get that sense of clarity in relation to their stated goals and objectives, typically we're looking at three things before we look at an investment proposition. And that is the investment time horizon. When exactly will we be calling on this money that we're nestling away for a point in the future? What required return do we need to meet that future stated objective? And then what kind of capacity for loss do we have as well? Because in its strictest sense, from a regulator's perspective, we have the ESMA risk rating scale of 1 to 7. And an awful lot of the companies that are out there using rules of thumb, it will ask you to fill in one of their risk profiles, risk questionnaires, and suddenly you come back as a 3 or 4 or 5 of 7 or whatever that number might be. And ta-da, here we go. We have an out-of-the-box solution. You can go into this particular portfolio, and that should actually deal with your investment criteria. And yeah, that fund is technically suitable, but it's not necessarily what's in the client's best interest. So again, when we look at the client's finances in the broader spectrum, and this isn't measured by a statement of suitability issued by to the client necessarily, but we do a lot of heavy lifting at the initial financial planning stage to really get under the bonnet as to what's going on with the client's finances in the first instance. But there's also a whole area of psychology with the client as well. Some people have unnecessarily complicated financial matters that need to almost be unpeeled, if you like, or unpacked, I guess. And if we can get things back down to basics, we can then look at the composition of funds acting in the client's best interest. So, it's a long, drawn-out process, but bearing in mind, if we're working towards a stated position of a future goal or objective, that if we can do all this heavy unpacking at the start, it's really easy to execute a financial plan at that point.
But I guess the opposite is true then, is it? If you didn't know these important matters in a person's, and it could be very personal, well, personal in the sense, in the sense of attitudes to risk and, their time horizons and their needs and that kind of stuff. But without that, you can't really do a best interests for the client or suitability assessment.
Not at all. And I would be quite critical of how we currently do it right now, because as I said, fill in this risk questionnaire. Oh, you're a 4 of 7. So therefore you go into this particular portfolio and that's it, sort it. It doesn't even necessarily give much insight into what the client's balance sheet is, the asset base, because if your investors in a personal capacity, over there, forget about your kind of pension, like nothing, your finances cannot operate in a silo type of environment. It can't be transactional. I have a pot of money here, I need to invest it. Oh, now I have another pot of money, I need to invest this. Totally isolated from the other things that you've gone on with your finances. But we still, as advisors, claiming to represent clients' interests, we're still, as an industry, as a profession, thinking transactionally when we need to operate holistically.
I'm making a note of robo-advisors, Bob, because I can feel that being another topic in another podcast. And this, how does an algorithm pick up on, the body language that you might detect when somebody clams up over their attitude to risk or whatever. Anyway, make a note of that. But so once you've done this process, you've set your objectives and you have this understanding. As an independent financial advisor, then how do you go about constructing a portfolio? You presumably have a free hand in terms of where you look for, let's say it's in investment funds or how the money is going to be managed. So how do you narrow that down to something that's useful and in the best interest of the person in front of you?
Well, so in the first instance, we can construct any type of portfolio under the sun, but we don't. And let me just try to expand on that point. The vast majority of clients that I advise have a similar background. They're a similar stage in life, similar goals and objectives, albeit there are obviously nuances, if you like, from one investor to the other. But one thing that is part of the investment strategy in-house in the business is there are a couple of things that must feature in a client's portfolio. And that is global diversification will always trump investing in single securities or single assets. We also look at the impact of fees and charges on the client's investment as well, because if we can set up a portfolio where the fees and charges are, let's use the term reasonable as opposed to cheap, that reasonable fees and charges versus excessive fees and charges in an active environment always trumps going down the actively managed route. And there's all this evidence that suggests that an active fund manager, while he or she might be able to compete and excel on a short-term basis, long-term, typically the opposite is very much the case. So when looking at portfolios, we have portfolios constructed which are globally diversified, reasonably priced, if you like, and then they are buy and hold strategies as well. So this idea that we're trying to outguess the market and outplay the market, we believe that the market is constructed as such a well-oiled machine that we're not trying to outsmart the markets. We're trying to buy a piece of the market, a large piece of the market, and let capitalism work away in the background for the next 30 years on your pension or whatever it might be.
Well, we have value for money as one of our topics, and active passive probably feeds into all of that for a later episode. So I won't pick too deep on that one.
Yeah.
But certainly when it comes to putting the portfolio together, then are you talking about, are they structured as pensions or pension related vehicles? And then secondly, is the underlyings then, are they direct investments in securities? Are they investments in funds, or what? How does all that get put together?
So they're typically investments in mutual funds, and a few of the portfolios that we offer to clients have literally 12,000 securities within the mutual fund portfolio that's structured. So it is a very definition of global diversification. You're buying the planet, whether it's emerging markets and the developed world, if you like, and everything in between, if you like. So it must always be globally diversified. This idea, what we see with a lot of investors coming to us is they have, I don't know what it is, maybe it's an Irish investor thing. We love property. We love apartments down in Tullow, Section 23 type of stuff. We love houses in Terranure as rental properties. But after we get into it, that initial conversation, we're talking about stresses and anxieties in relation to money. And what a lot of investors will share with me is their investment strategy to date was cobbled together without necessarily any guiding principles on what an investment philosophy looks like. And by the time you take the estate agent and the lender and the insurance company and the solicitor and the tenant and the RTB and, there's a huge amount of parties involved in property investment, for instance. And it's also then an individual security. So, if the flat roof of that investment property you own in Terranure falls in the middle of winter, you're then dealing with an insurance company and a building contractor and the list goes on. So what we try to do every possible occasion is we try to present an investment proposition which is globally diversified, which has a custodian bank, I suppose, offering a level of security there for the client, that the client knows where their money is sitting, and it's not in a convoluted, fund which has cash and equities and bonds and this, that, the other being actively managed. It's something which is a buy and hold, long-term buy and hold investment strategy. And the client knows exactly what they're buying into. The client knows exactly what the fees are. The client knows exactly who's acting as custodian of their money and how they can get access to it if they needed it short term. A lot of this, though, for the woman who's 50-ish, a lot of times, most times, it's wrapped up within a pension structure, providing obviously there's income there which is subject to income tax, because there's no point in doing something investing long term for when you intend retiring outside of a pensions contract, because at the end of the day, the tax relief attached to pension schemes is still at this point in time very good and should be used if it's a thing, the money and the fund you're trying to build is for your later years.
And do you find it difficult, Bob, to talk people out of their semi-D rental property in Terranure and into something that might serve them better?
Not anymore. A few years ago, I suppose, when property prices were looking like they were ramping up again, it was a much more difficult conversation to have. And part of the challenge I have as an investment advisor is, if clients come to me looking for their investments to date to be rubber stamped, to get a pat on the back saying, look, Danny, great job, you have these 6 apartments in Tullow or whatever, I suppose I approach it from the perspective that I tell you what you need to hear as opposed to what you'd like to hear, because there's a lot at stake. If we get it wrong, it can go horribly wrong. So having that honest, open conversation with the client has been something that I've brought to the business from day one. Over the last year or two, though, you see the property market in Ireland is much more uncertain today. Right down to if you do decide to sell your property and given your tenants notice of your intention to quit the tenancy, for instance, in a COVID world, that has obviously been upended. We don't know where the property market is going to go in the future. All your capital is illiquid because it's tied up in bricks and mortar. And if you remove the rental income from the property because your tenants moved out, you now have a whole load of capital tied up in bricks and mortar, which isn't actually providing any income to you whatsoever. So the conversation I'm having, just to answer your question, in relation to property as an investment proposition, has become a lot easier to redirect clients' capital into the likes of a globally diversified mutual funds portfolio, as opposed to their apartments dotted around the country.
I have 2 questions left before we wrap up this episode of the Aquest Podcast, Bob. The first one is, a lot of the regulatory regime around investing and protecting investors, or certainly quite a bit of it, revolves around disclosure to investors and transparency.
Yeah.
And I guess for it to be effective, and my experience as a regulator was that it's very hard, although you are protecting investors, it's very hard to actually get to investors to and get their feedback and get their input as stakeholders into consultations or whatever. But a large part of how they are protected assumes that they have a level of interest and engagement in the process of their investing. Is that a fair assessment? Like when you deal with people and you're bringing out spreadsheets or you're presenting numbers and charts, do eyes glaze over? Are they interested enough to kind of put the energy involved, put the energy in to understand what's being presented to them? Or is that kind of a waste of time? They just feel like this is it. I'm a 50-year-old librarian or whatever I am. This is side of my remit. Just tell me what to do, Bob, and I'll where to start.
Well, Danny, I'd like to say that first of all, when clients come to me, we have riveting conversations about pensions. It's edge off your seat type of stuff, let me tell you. No, it's. I'd answer your question along these lines. It depends on who the client has engaged, who the investor has engaged to advise them. Because if, again, you're thinking transactionally and you rock up to, your local broker, the broker is there going, right, I will sell you this pension or this particular investment. We're not going to be focused on a relationship in the short, medium, and long term. And that's the type of thing where the client asks a couple of questions. The broker says, look, we're going to do this and you'll be fine, and put your money in here and off you go, and call me in a few years' time if you want to do something else. If it's a thing you're engaging someone like me, and when my clients come in, we talk about death, family, what you've done to date, hopes, ambitions. We talk about every aspect of your life. It's part of building that relationship. So clients get engaged with me just because the conversation is much more broad, and because the initial conversation we have is teeing up a long-term relationship. So again, you do the transactional bit, you're not overly engaged. If you know you're going to see your man Bob in 6 months' time, and then again 6 months after that, and that's going to be it for the next few years, clients tend to want to know more, want to be more engaged, take a much greater sense of involvement and ownership of their finances. Because what I do in this business, I would probably describe myself more as a coach or a mentor. It's let me help you understand what you're doing with your money and how it's actually going to impact on your life. So disclosures and suitability and all that type of stuff, from a regulatory perspective, I have to box off that just to ensure that the central bank is happy with how I'm doing business. But I would suggest that clients, when the relationship is framed a certain way, clients are interested and engaged. But again, we also take a perspective that we want simple and straightforward as the essence of your investment strategy in the future as well.
Excellent. And so we're going to pick up on some of those themes again in later episodes, but particularly is it that a bit about the engagement of the clients and then how that feeds into effective transparency and disclosures are for protecting them. But the last question for this podcast, Bob, is do you find clients come in with preconceived ideas or notions about the latest fad? So have you people queuing around the block for crypto, Bitcoin funds? Are you all over ESG? What's the fads?
Well, in the first instance, fads are not entertained in my business, just because, like, I set up on 21st December 2010, just coming out of the Wall Street crash at that time. And it's etched in my mind as to what people were doing in the run-up to the financial crash that time. So we don't facilitate fads. We don't.
You're no fun, Bob. You're no fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So given the fact that a lot of our clients are referrals from existing clients, the expectation's already been set. But every now and again, like I have one long-term client. He runs a big business. He's not a 50-ish woman, but his wife is. But this guy is always chomping at the bit. Last year, he brought in a guy to me who has a gold mine, not a word of a lie, a gold mine in Australia, wondering if he should invest in that. And every single time I have to pull on the reins and say, look, we're not doing this, we're not doing it. If it doesn't fit into global diversification, and if we can't see where your money is sitting, and if we can't get your money back at short notice, not interested in facilitating it. So I oftentimes deal with some clients who maybe, I'm going to be cheeky enough to say, lose the run of themselves, get blinded by the marketing material that they get from whatever company in question. And I oftentimes have to bring them back to basics, saying it does not fit in with the investment philosophy you've signed up to. It does not fit in with your overall investment portfolio. And it is not helping us move a step closer to fulfilling your stated goals and objectives. So when it's put back on the client like that, the fads tend to wither on a rock, thankfully. But the vast majority of my clients that I'm in regular contact with know that they can oftentimes float a proposition to me, but they know what the pillars of the investment advice are here, and it's very easy to either rule it in or quickly rule it out, as the case might be.
So no Australian gold mines then, Bob?
Not in 2020, at least, no.
I tell you, no fun. I saw the show on the channel. They seem to be a great idea, these Australian gold mines. Yeah.
Well, okay. By all means, if anyone who's not a client of mine would like to invest in Australian gold mines, knock yourself out, have a lot of fun. I would suggest, though, going back to the fun part, it is important to actually to actually be engaged with your money. And I would suggest that people could perhaps set aside some of their net worth to do something a bit silly, a little bit risque, if you like, and let's call it Play-Doh. Money you get to play with, and if you lose it, you lose it. What about? But what I don't want people to do is sacrifice their entire retirement fund on a gold mine in Australia, for instance. Take 10 grand and go crazy or whatever, but hands off that pot of money that you need to provide you with an income when you're old and grey.
Thank you very much, Bob.
All right, cheers, Danny.
So that's the topic for the next episode. Thanks very much, Bob, for joining us on the Aquest Podcast. We'll wrap it up there. We'll catch you next time on the Aquest Podcast.
You've been listening to the Aquest Podcast. For information about our training and advisory programs or our academy, visit aquest.ie. For more resources on regs, funds, and governance, check out our YouTube channel, Daniel Lawlor, RU, RQ.